Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It started with a question, a simple thought that wouldn't leave me alone. What if the basement is more than just a storage room? I never really gave much thought to the basement of the old house. It was just a place where things were kept, boxes of forgotten memories, old furniture, dust. But after moving in, I began to feel an unsettling draw toward it, like something was calling me from beneath the floorboards. At first, it was just curiosity. A flicker of something strange, deep down, hidden away. The house itself was ordinary. A rundown Victorian structure with creaky floors and faded wallpaper. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. It was the kind of place you'd walk through without a second glance, the kind of place that would make anyone feel safe. But there was something about this house that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At night, the silence was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in a peaceful countryside. No, this was different. The silence here felt heavy, as if it were a living thing, waiting, watching. There was a particular smell, too. It started faint, but over time, it became stronger, like mildew mixed with something older. Something that didn't belong. But the basement. It had always been the one place I avoided. Even though I knew there was nothing in there except old things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting for me. The basement door stood there at the end of the hallway, always slightly ajar, like it was waiting for me to open it. The first time I heard the sound was when I was sitting in my living room, the house wrapped in darkness, save for the glow of my dim lamp. It was a small noise at first, a scraping, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I froze, my pulse quickening, but I told myself it was nothing. A rat, maybe, or the house settling. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the pages of the book I was reading. But the sound kept coming. Slow, deliberate. Closer. I stood up, my heart thumping in my chest. The noise was louder now, unmistakable. It was coming from the basement. There was no doubt in my mind. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but something about that sound didn't sit right with me. It was too intentional, too purposeful. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my hand gripping the banister as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. It's just my imagination, I thought. It's nothing. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, the door to the basement stood open as if it had been waiting for me. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't place. The faintest scent of something rotting mixed with the smell of damp earth. A sudden chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. The basement had never felt this way before. I stepped closer, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and leave. But something, some unexplainable force, made me take another step. My breath came in short gasps as I reached the door. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker at the edge of my vision. But as my eyes adjusted, the shadow became more defined, more solid. A figure, moving, no, slithering across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I should have run. I should have slammed the door shut and never looked back. But I didn't. The figure, it wasn't quite human. There was something wrong about it. Its shape shifted in and out of focus, like a trick of the light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but when I opened my eyes again, it was closer. The sound of its movement grew louder, like dragging nails on stone. It's just your mind, I tried to convince myself. It's just the shadows playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot as I stared at the thing in the dark. The basement felt colder now, the air thick and suffocating. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, but I couldn't wake up. I couldn't move. The shadow paused, as if aware of my presence, and then, slowly, deliberately, it turned toward me. Its eyes. Those eyes. They weren't human. They were hollow, empty, black pits that seemed to pull everything around them into darkness. I felt myself falling, lost in them. Was this real? My mind screamed, but I couldn't answer. The figure began to move toward me again, its body stretching, contorting in unnatural ways until its twisted shape was right in front of me. Then, the world around me seemed to distort. I gasped for air, stumbling backward, my heart racing, my vision blurred by fear. The shadows seemed to swallow the room whole, until all I could see were those eyes. And then everything went dark. I woke up gasping, my body covered in a cold sweat, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The familiar scent of old wood and dust was gone. Instead, there was the sharp tang of metal, something I couldn't place but made my stomach turn. I was lying on the floor of the basement. The door was still open, and the faintest hint of moonlight filtered in from the top of the stairs, casting long, twisted shadows on the floor. But the air felt different now, thicker, oppressive. It was the kind of silence that crushed you, as though the house itself had taken a breath and was holding it in, waiting. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling as I pushed myself off the cold stone floor. The panic from the moment before, when that thing had been standing in front of me, was still fresh in my mind, gnawing at my consciousness. But it was gone now. The basement was empty, silent. No sign of the figure, no strange sounds, no movement. I reached for the railing to help myself up the stairs, my hand shaking as I touched it, as if the very act of climbing would make the room collapse around me. My mind raced, questions swirling in the void. What had I seen? Was it real? Or was it just my imagination, a product of stress or exhaustion? I forced myself to climb the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top, I froze. Something was wrong. The silence felt deeper, more suffocating, like it was closing in on me. I turned back, my gaze shifting to the basement door. It stood there, still slightly ajar. For a second, I thought I saw something flicker behind it, a shadow, maybe? A movement I couldn't quite make out. I couldn't stay in this house. Not now. Not after what I had felt. But my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by the thought that whatever that thing was, it hadn't gone. It was still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stumbled back into the living room, trying to ignore the tingling sensation crawling across my skin. My mind kept replaying the moment, those eyes, that shadow. It felt like something had crawled inside me, and I couldn't shake it. The weight of it was crushing, a pressure against my chest that wouldn't let up. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. I glanced around the room, trying to anchor myself in the familiar. Everything looked normal. The old bookshelf, the table, the couch. Nothing had changed. But it had, hadn't it? The silence in the house had taken on a new quality, something menacing. The shadows now seemed to stretch further, the walls closer, as though the very space around me had contracted. I couldn't trust my eyes anymore. A low creak echoed from the hallway. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. It was the sound of footsteps. I jumped up, my heart leaping into my throat, the room spinning. No, 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 I thought. I'm not going back down there. But then, in the distance, I heard it again. A whisper. Barely audible, like the faintest breath against my ear. It's coming closer. I turned toward the hallway. The light was dim, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. The air had grown colder, colder than it should have been for a night in winter. I could see my breath now, curling in front of me like a mist. And then, from the corner of my eye, something moved. It was only a flicker, a subtle shift in the darkness. But it was enough to make my pulse race. My eyes darted to the doorway, but there was nothing there. Nothing. I was losing my mind. The fear, the anxiety, had it driven me to this point? I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was it the house? Was it me? I backed up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming to get out, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The whisper came again, this time clearer, almost like a name being called, but I couldn't make it out. I had to go. I turned and sprinted toward the front door, desperate to escape, to get away from whatever was inside that house. But as I reached for the handle, something caught my eye, a glimmer of light reflected in the dark glass. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had seen before. It stood tall, its form shifting in the shadows, like smoke but with substance, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits. The same eyes from the basement. And then I heard it. A voice. It was low, guttural, like a whisper in my mind, something so deep and cold that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You shouldn't have opened the door. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't move. My legs were frozen, as if trapped in place by some invisible force. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure's presence was consuming everything. The light from the street lamp outside flickered, casting a brief moment of clarity, and in that instant, I saw it clearly, its jagged smile, its unblinking eyes, its outstretched hand reaching for me. It was coming closer. I couldn't move. The figure was right in front of me now, its form undulating, shifting in ways that made my eyes ache. Its hollow, black eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, watching with an intensity that felt like it was peeling away every layer of my mind. It wasn't just a figure. It was something that knew me, something that had always been there, waiting. My mouth was dry, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out the whispering voice that now filled the air. You shouldn't have opened the door. The words were inside my head, vibrating through my skull, and they were familiar. I didn't understand. It felt as though I had heard them before, but I couldn't place when or where. I took a step back, my body moving of its own accord, driven by the primal need to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The door was still behind me, but the figure was too close now, and the space between us seemed to stretch as though it were distorting, warping the world itself. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. My vision blurred, and the air grew colder, so cold it burned my skin. I could see my breath, each exhale coming out in jagged clouds of vapor, as if the very temperature of the room was dropping, becoming more and more unnatural. The figure reached toward me, its hand extending in an unearthly way, too long, too distorted. Each movement was accompanied by a low, unsettling creak, like bones snapping under the weight of the world. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I didn't want to. Something about its presence. I couldn't fight it. There was no escape. The closer it came, the more my body felt like it was being sucked into a void, like I was being drawn into a place where nothing mattered, where I didn't matter. I staggered backward, my legs giving way beneath me, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Its fingers were almost upon me now. Its cold breath hit my face, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It smelled like decay, like something that had been dead for far too long. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, I realized something. I knew this place. I knew this feeling. I had been here before, but I couldn't remember when. It was like I was caught in a loop, like I had always been here, staring at this same creature, unable to move, unable to escape. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was something real. The room around me began to warp, the walls stretching outward as though the house itself was twisting. The familiar furniture, the warm glow of the streetlights outside, all of it started to distort, bending and shifting in impossible angles. The shadows grew longer, more pronounced, until they swallowed the room whole. The figure's hand was now inches from my face. I could feel its icy fingers brushing against my skin, sending a shock of cold through my veins. "You opened the door," it repeated, the voice now echoing inside my head, reverberating like 1,000 whispers at once. "And now, you will stay with me, forever." I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to move, to break free, but my body wouldn't respond. The floor seemed to shift beneath me, like I was standing on something unstable, like I was sinking into the very foundations of the house. And then the darkness came. It swallowed everything. I don't know how long I was in that place. Time had no meaning anymore. I was trapped in a void, a space where nothing existed except for the relentless voice, the whispers in my mind, and the endless pull of the shadows. The figure was still there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting. And then, suddenly, I was back. I gasped as the light of the lamp flickered back to life, the familiar sights of the living room flooding my vision. I was on the floor, my hands gripping the carpet, my breath ragged and shallow. The cold had lifted, but the air still felt wrong, like it was heavy with something unseen, something just out of reach. I looked around frantically, but the room was the same as it had been before. The chair was still in the corner. The bookshelves lined the walls. The door stood slightly ajar. But everything felt distant, like I was viewing it from behind a thick glass. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, my body trembling as if I had just woken from a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. I needed to leave. I had to get out of the house. I turned to the door, but before I could take a step, something caught my eye. The same glimmer of light from earlier, the reflection of something in the window. I walked toward it, cautiously, my every step echoing in the dead silence of the room. As I reached the window, I saw it. In the reflection, standing right behind me, was the figure. I spun around, but it was gone. My chest tightened in panic. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something was hunting me. But I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I bolted for the door, yanked it open, and ran into the night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but it didn't help. It didn't calm the terror clawing at my insides. I ran. I didn't stop. But even as I fled, I knew it was still following me. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my breath ragged, but no matter how fast I moved, no matter how many corners I turned, that feeling, the one that made my skin crawl, didn't fade. It was like something was just out of sight, always waiting, always just behind me. The cold air of the night felt suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides, wrapping around my throat like a tightening noose. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I didn't care. My mind was consumed with the image of that thing, its black eyes, its cold fingers reaching for me. The streets were empty, eerily so. It was late, I knew that, but even the occasional light from a distant house couldn't shake the heavy quiet that settled over everything. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned a corner, my feet stumbling, and there it was, the reflection. A single street lamp flickered ahead, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but that's not what caught my attention. It was the window of the old store, a place I had passed countless times. For a moment, the reflection in the glass didn't make sense. It wasn't me that I saw. It was the thing. The figure was standing behind me, as if it had been waiting for me all along, hidden in the reflection of the window. Its smile, that twisted grin, was stretched across its face, its hollow eyes staring directly into mine. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was moving. I didn't have to turn around. I knew it was there, right behind me, just out of my peripheral vision. I could feel its presence, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, heart hammering, fists clenched, but the street was empty. Nothing. No one. I looked back at the window. The reflection was gone. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I pressed them against my face, trying to ground myself. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just your mind playing tricks. You're exhausted. You're not thinking straight. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong. And it was getting worse. I took a few hesitant steps forward, trying to shake the feeling of being hunted, but it was no use. Every corner I turned, every shadow I passed, felt like it was closing in on me. It was like I had stepped into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The street ahead seemed endless, a dark tunnel with no end. I tried to focus on the lights, on the sounds of the city, but they were muted, distant. It was as if I were trapped in some otherworldly place, far removed from everything I knew. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their windows black voids that seemed to stare right through me. That's when I heard it. A whisper. So soft, so faint, that I thought it was the wind at first. You shouldn't have left. I froze. The voice, it was the same. That low, guttural tone. I knew it. It was the figure's voice. But this time, it wasn't in my head. It was right in front of me, coming from the shadows. I turned, my eyes scanning the street, but all I could see were the dark shapes of the buildings, the empty pavement. The voice had stopped, but the chill that followed it lingered. My breath came out in shaky bursts, and I tried to steady myself, to think clearly, but the panic was suffocating. Suddenly, a door creaked open behind me, and I whirled around, my heart racing. A figure stepped out, but it wasn't the thing. It was a man, tall, unshaven, wearing a dark coat. He didn't seem to notice me at first. He was just standing there, looking at something on the ground. Relief washed over me, though it was short-lived. My mind screamed at me that I shouldn't trust anyone, that no one was really safe. But I couldn't stand the isolation anymore. I needed help. I walked up to him, hesitant at first, but when he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. There was a tiredness in his eyes, something that made him seem almost familiar. "You okay?" he asked, his voice raspy. I nodded quickly, my words failing me. I opened my mouth to speak, but all that came out was a strangled breath. His gaze shifted to the street behind me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something almost like recognition. "Do you see it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I might collapse right there. The man stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking into the shadows, into the alleyway behind me. "Don't look," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's too late." I didn't know what he meant, but before I could ask, the streetlight flickered again. A cold gust of wind swept through the alley, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move within the shadows. Something tall. Something dark. The man grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Run," he whispered urgently. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I broke into a sprint, the sound of my feet pounding against the pavement echoing through the street. The man was right behind me, but even as I ran, I could feel it again. Something was coming, something was following. I could hear it now, faint footsteps growing louder, drawing closer. I glanced behind me, and there it was. The figure. Its face was twisted in an expression of rage, its eyes black and empty, its form towering and unnatural. It was getting closer, moving with an impossible speed, its arms stretching toward me. The man shouted something, but I didn't hear it. I was running on instinct now, my body moving faster than my mind could comprehend. We turned another corner, and I looked ahead. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The street didn't end. It just stretched into darkness, like an infinite tunnel, and the shadows were closing in, swallowing the light. And in the distance, I could hear the whisper again. "You can never escape." I didn't look back. I couldn't. The darkness behind me was too much, like something was reaching for me from beyond the edge of the world, and I could feel it getting closer, its grip tightening around my chest with each passing moment. The sound of my breath, ragged and panicked, filled my ears, drowning out everything else. The man who had been with me was gone. I didn't know where he had gone or why he had left me, but the streets were empty now, swallowed by the night. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The pavement beneath my feet began to tremble, almost as if it were alive, shifting, breathing. I stumbled, my mind foggy and my thoughts fragmented. What had happened to the world I knew? This place, this city, didn't look right. The buildings, once familiar, now looked distorted, their shapes bending in unnatural angles, as if they were stretching, trying to escape the confines of reality. I kept running, my legs burning, but no matter how fast I moved, the streets seemed to stretch on forever, never ending. There were no turns, no alleys to duck into, just a long, unbroken stretch of pavement that led deeper into the dark abyss. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder with each step. You can't outrun it. I flinched, the words seeping into my mind like poison, twisting their way through my thoughts. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence, a weight pressing down on my soul. My heart raced. I knew it wasn't just a figure that was following me. It was something far worse, something that wanted to break me, to tear apart everything that made me human. I saw something flicker in the distance, a faint light, like a star in a pitch-black sky. I ran toward it, hoping it was some kind of salvation. But as I got closer, the light flickered and warped, changing shape, growing darker, until it wasn't a light at all. It was a door, a warped, broken door that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The door was wrong. It didn't belong here. There was no reason for a door to be standing in the middle of the street, not in the place where everything had become so distorted. It was like a part of the house I had escaped from, like something had reached through from that other world into this one, dragging its nightmares with it. I hesitated. Should I go through it? Should I keep running? Every instinct told me to run, to leave this place behind, but my legs refused to move. It was like I was drawn to the door, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. Something was waiting on the other side. I didn't know what, but I had to know. I reached out, my hand trembling as it brushed against the cold, splintered wood. The instant my fingers made contact, I felt a jolt of cold electricity shoot up my arm, sending a wave of nausea through my body. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, their voices overlapping, speaking in a language that I couldn't understand. You can never leave. It's already inside you. The door creaked open on its own, revealing only darkness behind it. A void, swallowing everything in its path, pulling me in like a powerful current. I could see shapes moving in the blackness beyond, shapes that didn't belong, things that were alive in a way that was wrong, unnatural. I took a deep breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. With every ounce of willpower I had, I forced myself to step forward into the dark. The instant I crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The ground beneath me seemed to fall away, and I was no longer standing on the street. The air was thick with a cold, oppressive weight. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against me from all sides, and the faint sound of the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I turned around, expecting to see the door, the world I had come from, but it was gone. There was nothing. Just endless, unending darkness stretching out in every direction. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. But I wasn't. The darkness shifted again, and I saw it, the figure. It was standing just a few feet away, its eyes black holes in its face, its mouth stretched into that horrible grin. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, moving like a living thing. I felt the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting as the creature took a step forward, its long, distorted arms reaching out toward me. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it was no longer just a shadow. It was real, tangible, a being of pure malice that radiated an aura of pure dread. It didn't need to speak to me anymore. Its presence alone was enough to freeze my heart in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in place, as the darkness crept closer, swallowing up everything in its path. Suddenly, a sound, something loud, something sharp, echoed through the void. The figure flinched, its form twisting as though something was forcing it back. I felt a strange pull inside me, like something deep within was calling me to move, to do something, anything. My body responded against my will, and I took a step back, then another. The ground beneath me cracked, a jagged, black fissure opening in the earth, splitting the world apart. The figure screamed, a horrible sound that made my blood run cold. The scream echoed through the void, a sound that carried the weight of infinite despair. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran, faster than I had ever run before, as the darkness behind me surged, as the figure's presence tried to reach me once again. But this time, the void was closing in on itself, collapsing, like a broken mirror being shattered into 1,000 pieces. I ran faster, the crack in the ground widening, but with every step, the air grew heavier, the darkness deeper. The world was no longer solid. It was breaking apart, slipping through my fingers like sand. And just when I thought I would fall into that endless abyss, I felt it, light. A sliver of light, bright and warm, cutting through the blackness like a lifeline. I reached for it with everything I had, my body trembling with the last remnants of strength I could muster. But just before I touched it, I heard it again, the whisper. You can't escape. You belong here now. There are moments in life that define us. They are the seconds that last an eternity. It's strange how a single event, a blink, can change everything. I never understood that until the crash. The world spun, the screeching of tires, the gut-wrenching sound of metal twisting and breaking, and then darkness. Complete, suffocating darkness. But even in the black void, I knew, deep down, I wasn't alone. I woke up in a hospital room. My body was battered, bruised, stitched back together in a way that felt wrong. My ribs hurt with every breath, my right arm was encased in a cast, and my left leg was bound in a hard, unyielding brace. But it wasn't the physical pain that clung to me, it was the fear. The fear that something was following me, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my every thought. When they told me my family was gone, I thought I might fall apart. But I didn't. I just stared at the blank walls of my room, the sterile white that felt so suffocating, and tried to process the weight of their absence. My mind couldn't make sense of it. How had we gotten here? I thought I had survived. But the shadows that now followed me, whispered a different truth. I could see them at the edges of my vision. The faces of my wife and children, their final moments replaying over and over like a nightmare I couldn't escape. They were there, just out of reach, watching me. But they weren't really there. Were they? The first time I saw her, my wife, Claire, it was just a flicker. A shape in the corner of the room, a fleeting movement that felt like déjà vu, like I should know what was happening, but couldn't understand why. Then, she spoke. Why didn't you save us? The voice wasn't real. I knew it couldn't be. But I still turned, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see her. But there was only the empty hospital room, cold and still. The shadows of her face remained, hanging in the corners of my mind, refusing to leave. The memories were always there, but now they had become alive. Each night it grew worse. The shadows grew clearer, more defined. They were like fragments of my memory, piecing together something that wasn't right. Something that was slipping into my mind, uninvited, tearing at the fabric of my reality. The shadows moved, shifted, as if they were taking form. They weren't just memories anymore. They were alive. And every time they came closer, the air grew colder. At first, I tried to dismiss it. It was all in my head. The trauma, the grief. It was making me see things. But as the days passed, I couldn't ignore it. The shapes, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't just stress. It was something else. One night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the darkness of my room, listening to the sound of my own breathing, the rhythmic, heavy exhale that had become my only companion. That's when I heard it again. A soft rustling, as if someone was moving in the shadows. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I knew it. The room around me felt thick, the air pressed against me like it was closing in. Then came the voice. Low, guttural, like something that wasn't meant to speak. Why did you survive? I froze. The question echoed through my mind like an ice-cold knife. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see, but my body betrayed me. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes scanning the room, searching the corners. There was nothing. The shadows were as they had always been, but now they moved. They swirled, twisted, pulsed with an unnatural life of their own. And then I saw them again. The faces. My son, Michael, his eyes wide with fear. Claire, her lips parted in that final scream as the car flipped, her hand reaching toward me, and then nothing. I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to move, to get away, but my body was frozen. The shadows were pulling me in, closer and closer, and I could feel their cold hands around my neck, around my chest. They were suffocating me. And just when I thought I couldn't breathe anymore, when I thought the darkness would consume me, I heard a knock. A gentle, insistent knock on the door. I gasped for air, my heart hammering in my chest, and I scrambled out of bed, stumbling toward the door. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, my mind a blur of terror and confusion. I didn't know what to expect when I opened it. The shadows, the faces, had been real, hadn't they? I opened the door. Nothing. No one was there. Just the empty hallway, the flickering light above, casting long shadows across the floor. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last. The air was thick. Heavy. Like something was watching me. Waiting. I turned back to the room, and the shadows, they had followed me. The faces, my family, were there once again, their eyes fixed on me with that same accusing gaze. The air was colder now, the whispers louder. Why did you survive? I stumbled back into the room, my heart racing. The walls seemed to close in on me. The room was no longer just a place of rest, it had become a prison. A place where memories bled into reality. A place where they weren't just gone, but here. I was losing myself. The shadows, the whispers, the faces, they weren't just memories anymore. They were alive, feeding on my fear, feeding on my guilt. And I wasn't sure if I could ever escape them. But even worse, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to anymore. I tried to escape it. I really did. But the shadows, the faces, they wouldn't let me. They followed me everywhere. At first, I thought I could push them away, could convince myself it was just the aftershock of the crash, that the trauma was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake them. The voices, their voices, were becoming louder now, clearer. They spoke to me in the dead of night, in the silence of the day. Everywhere. Why did you survive? I tried to drown it out. I tried to focus on the simple things, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, but nothing worked. The house felt empty. Hollow. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. like it was no longer my home. It was around the 4th day after I was released from the hospital when things took a darker turn. I had tried to go back to work. It seemed like the logical step, a way to find some normalcy again. The office was quiet, the dull buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, the soft tap of keyboards in the distance. But there was a strange weight in the air, like everyone was avoiding me. They smiled politely, but their eyes were cold, distant. Almost like they couldn't look at me without seeing what I had seen in the wreck. I sat down at my desk, trying to focus, but I could feel the eyes of the others on me. Not physically, no. It wasn't like they were staring at me, but I could feel them. I could feel their judgment. Then came the whisper again. Why didn't you save us? I froze, my hands shaking as they hovered over the keyboard. The words weren't in my head this time. They were out there, coming from somewhere nearby. I quickly turned around, scanning the office. Nothing, but the air was thick with something I couldn't identify. A scent, sweet and rotten, like something was decaying in the walls. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. I knew that. I could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of it. But when I turned back to the desk, the shadow in my peripheral vision was gone. Or at least, I thought it was. I wasn't sure anymore. Their faces, came again that night. I was at home, sitting in the dark, staring at the wall, trying to force my mind to shut off. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape them. I had tried everything, drinking myself into a stupor, even taking sleeping pills, but nothing worked. Nothing ever worked. The faces, they were everywhere. And now, they were more than just faces. They were people. People who had never existed in my life before the crash. They were becoming real. I sat there, frozen in the living room, as the temperature seemed to drop. The air felt so heavy now, like I was submerged underwater. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and twisted, reaching for me. And that's when I heard it again. Why didn't you save us? It was Claire's voice this time, her tone frantic, desperate. I stood up so quickly I knocked over the chair, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned to face the voice, my mind screaming that it couldn't be real. It was just my mind, playing tricks. It had to be. But when I looked toward the doorway, I saw her. Claire. But she wasn't really there, not entirely. She was distorted. Her face was twisted in a way that made my skin crawl, like a mask that didn't quite fit. She wasn't standing, but floating, her body hovering a foot off the ground, her eyes hollow, sunken. Her mouth moved, but her voice was muffled, drowned out by a low, buzzing hum that vibrated my bones. You should have been with us. You should have saved us. Her voice, though familiar, was alien, twisted with a distortion that made it sound like a scream stretched too thin. I could feel her presence in the room, the cold that radiated from her like a palpable force. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. No, this isn't real. I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't reply. Instead, her face contorted even further, her mouth stretching open impossibly wide, wider than it should have been, as if it was about to swallow me whole. Her hands, no, claws, reached out toward me, fingers elongating into twisted, sharp points. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Snap. The sound of her fingers snapping back to their normal position brought me back. She was gone. The room was empty again. But the presence, it lingered. My mind was slipping. I could feel it unraveling. Every night was the same. The shadows, the faces, the voices. They wouldn't leave me alone. The guilt, the shame, it had become too much to bear. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, fading with each passing moment. I couldn't tell if I was still in the waking world or if I had already been consumed by the nightmare. I was losing control, and I didn't know how to stop it. The worst part? I didn't want to. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to go this far. But I could feel it slipping like sand through my fingers. The memories, the shadows, they had taken root in my mind, and now they were growing, spreading like an infection I couldn't cure. I thought I was losing my grip. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But how could I deny it when it was happening right before my eyes? The days bled together. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my mind filled with echoes of their voices. Claire, Tom, Sarah. I couldn't escape them. No matter how much I tried to sleep, no matter how I tried to shut them out, they were always there. They were me. They were my thoughts, my guilt, my pain, every mistake I had ever made, every moment I had failed them, it was there. Floating in the air, suffocating me. It started getting worse when I started hearing their footsteps. I couldn't tell if it was real, but I knew it was. Every night, around 3 a.m., I would hear the faintest sound. Click. A footstep, followed by another. Slowly, relentlessly. They were coming closer. The first time it happened, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. I checked the locks on all the windows, the doors. But everything was as it should be. Still, the sound continued, echoing in the empty house. The unmistakable sound of feet shuffling, drawing closer. I turned off the lights. I held my breath, praying it would stop. But the footsteps didn't. They never stopped. Then came the whispers. Why didn't you save us? Claire's voice again, so clear, it was as if she were standing right next to me. But there was no one. No one at all. My heart was pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the chair, clutching the edge as I sat in the darkened room, trying not to move. Trying not to breathe too loudly. The air was thick now, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A sound from the corner of the room. Shoo. A scraping noise, like fingernails across a chalkboard. I turned to face it. The darkness in the corner of the room shifted. It wasn't just darkness anymore. It was something alive. Moving. Twisting, like something was hiding in it. Waiting. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something in the dark. Something watching. I could feel it now. It was like a pressure on my chest, a weight I couldn't escape. I could feel it all around me, surrounding me. The shadows were alive. I forced myself to get up, but my legs felt like lead. My vision swam, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. But I didn't. I stumbled toward the light switch, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I turned it on, the harsh yellow light blinding me. Nothing was there. Nothing at all. The shadows had receded, leaving only the walls of my apartment behind. But the air, it was thick with something unspoken. Something wrong. The hum in the room was deafening now, the silence that followed my movements too loud. I walked to the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. That this was just a side effect of the crash. That it wasn't real. But then, I heard it again. Click. Footsteps. From behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, but the kitchen was empty. The air was thick with the smell of burnt toast, but the stove was off. There was nothing there. Nothing but the faint trace of a shadow in the far corner of the room. I stepped closer to it. The light above flickered. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Why didn't you save us? Claire's voice. It was real this time. Clearer. Stronger. Coming from the shadow itself. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body locked up, my breath caught in my throat. And then, they were there. Her face. Twisted. Warped. The same vacant eyes, the same horrible distortion that had followed me from the wreck. The same coldness that consumed the room. But it wasn't just her. Tom. Sarah. I could see them too, lurking behind the shadows, their faces twisted in pain and anguish, their eyes wide open with accusation. They were all there, just behind the darkness. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. I could hear them, though. I'd felt them. The guilt. The weight of it. Every breath I took was a knife. Every heartbeat, a reminder of how I failed them. How I had survived when they had not. I'm sorry, I whispered. My voice was barely audible. I'm sorry, please. The shadows began to shift, the figures moving closer, their faces contorting, becoming more grotesque with each second. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. My throat was closed. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the terror. Then, just as suddenly as it started, they were gone. The figures disappeared back into the shadows. The room was empty again, except for the footsteps. They hadn't stopped. And I knew for certain that the nightmare had just begun. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The silence was too deafening, and the shadows still clung to the corners of my mind, even as I sat awake in the center of the living room. My eyes were wide, glued to the walls, the floor, anywhere that wasn't the dark corners of my own thoughts. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. The morning came, a dull gray light filtering through the blinds, but it did nothing to ease the suffocating weight in my chest. I barely moved, too afraid to go anywhere. The thought of leaving the house made me sick, like I was tethered to it by invisible chains. What if the shadows followed me? What if they didn't let me escape? I had to stay. I had to wait. I had to face it. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the strength to face the day. But the sound came again. That same click. The footstep. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I turned, my heart racing, searching for any sign of movement, but the room was empty. Nothing. The floor was bare, the walls untouched. I reached for my phone, hands trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. My fingers hovered over Claire's name for a moment. The temptation to call her, to beg her to come back, to help me, was overwhelming. But what could she do? She was gone. They were all gone. I couldn't bring myself to hit the call button. It felt wrong. I would just keep hearing their voices in my head. I would keep seeing their faces. A knock at the door. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a soft knock, but a sharp, insistent one. Someone was out there. But who? I hadn't seen anyone since the accident. I wasn't expecting anyone. My feet moved on their own, carrying me across the room before my brain could even register what was happening. I reached for the door handle, my mind screaming at me to stop, to think, but my body wouldn't listen. I pulled the door open. There was no one there. Just the emptiness of the hallway stretching before me. But as I stepped forward, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A footprint. It was small, delicate, like the shape of a woman's foot, and it was just inside the threshold, as if someone had been standing there, watching. I looked down the hallway, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the silence that stretched on for miles. My breath caught in my throat. The footprint was still there, taunting me. My hands reached out, as if I could somehow wipe it away, but it didn't fade. It was real. Too real. I backed away, slamming the door shut behind me. I stumbled back into the living room, shaking now. The air felt thick, oppressive. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The footsteps, they had followed me into the house. And now the shadows were gathering again, seeping through the walls, curling at the edges of my vision. I could feel them watching me. I tried to focus, to calm my thoughts. Maybe I could fight this. Maybe there was a way out. I grabbed my keys, and for a moment, I thought about driving. Just leaving. But the thought of the road, of the place where it had all happened, the twisted metal, the blood, the screeching tires, it paralyzed me. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't. But I had to do something. Anything. I had to find out what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands slick with sweat, and stumbled into the basement. It was dark, colder than usual, the air thick with dust. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I felt my heart race. I had to find answers. I had to stop this. The basement door creaked as I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The concrete walls were cracked, covered in a layer of grime and cobwebs. The air smelled like rot, like something had been festering here for years. Then I saw it. The shadow. It was bigger than before, darker, more solid. It hovered at the far end of the basement, just beyond the edge of the light. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whispering started again. Only this time, it wasn't just Claire's voice. It was all of them, Sarah, Tom, their voices overlapping, murmuring their accusations. You let us die. Why didn't you save us? You should have been there. It was too much. The guilt, the shame, it crushed me. I could feel myself slipping, falling into that deep, dark hole. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadow stepped closer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had shape. It had form. A figure. The figure was tall, thin, its face a blur of shifting lines, like it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. It moved closer, the whispering intensifying. The air was freezing now, biting into my skin. I could hear its ragged breathing, but it wasn't mine. It was something else. Something worse. You should have died instead. The words came through the air, cold and final. My vision blurred. The room started to spin. The world was closing in on me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling to the floor, the light flickering before it went out. I was plunged into darkness. And then I felt it. Cold hands on my shoulders. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. It was here. The cold hands on my shoulders tightened, their grip like ice, and my body froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only feel the oppressive weight of the shadow that loomed over me, its presence suffocating every ounce of air from my lungs. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispering, the shifting darkness, it all faded into nothingness, leaving only the sensation of being watched, of being haunted. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The pressure on my shoulders was unrelenting, like an invisible force that refused to let me go. And then, slowly, I began to hear it again. The whispers. Louder now. More distinct. Not just a cacophony of voices, but a single, unified presence. You left us, it said, its voice like 1,000 broken promises, jagged and filled with anguish. You couldn't save us, and now you'll never escape. My breath caught in my throat. The voices were no longer vague, fleeting memories. They were real. They were here. And they were angry. I turned my head, desperately trying to see something, anything, through the suffocating darkness. But all I could make out were shifting shadows, each one dancing like a living thing, stretching and twisting. They were everywhere, moving with a mind of their own, closing in on me. I could hear their voices more clearly now, each one accusing me, blaming me. Claire. Sarah. Tom. All of them. All the faces I had tried to forget, the faces I had failed to save. You should have died, Claire's voice echoed in the dark, as if it were the very air around me. You should have been the one in that car. The words sliced through me, deep into my soul. The guilt, God, the guilt, I could feel it clawing at my insides. The weight of it was unbearable. Stop, stop, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the deafening whispers. Please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But no one was listening. The shadows closed in tighter, suffocating me with their cold embrace. I could feel the walls of the basement pressing down on me, the ceiling lowering with each passing second, the space shrinking. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. A figure. A person. Or at least, what used to be a person. It was Claire. Or at least, it looked like her. The shape was the same, the outline, the familiar silhouette I had once known so well. But something was wrong. She was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and black, like empty voids. Her mouth twisted into a cruel, silent grin, and her hands, reached for me, fingers elongated and skeletal, scraping against the concrete floor. Come to us, her voice rasped. It was like nails on a chalkboard, jagged and guttural. You'll never be free. You will never leave. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of terror. I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness wrapping around me like chains. "You're trapped," she whispered. "There's no escape." I could feel it then, the pressure on my chest, the crushing weight of her words. The shadow had become real. It was no longer just an abstract fear, a manifestation of my mind. It was here, and it was going to consume me. The shadows twisted and writhed, taking on new forms. Sarah, Tom, their faces now distorted, their bodies broken, their eyes wide and unblinking. They reached for me, their voices calling out, demanding retribution for what I had done. The room spun, the walls caving in, and I collapsed to my knees, unable to breathe. My vision blurred, and I could feel the cold hands on my skin again, the weight of their touch suffocating me. I was drowning in it. Drowning in my own guilt, in their accusations, in the darkness that had consumed everything I once knew. Then, something shifted. A sudden sound. A scraping noise, like metal on metal, sharp and jarring. The air around me seemed to shift, the temperature rising slightly. The shadows paused. For a split second, the suffocating weight lifted. I tried to move, tried to crawl, to push myself away from the presence that was holding me captive. My hands found purchase on the cold concrete floor, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to stand. My legs were shaking, my body aching, but I refused to stay down. I needed to get out. I reached for the basement door, but the shadows were closing in again, faster this time. The whispers, the voices, they were getting louder, more insistent. I pulled at the door, my fingers slipping on the handle as I fought to open it. And then, something inside me snapped. With a force I didn't know I had, I yanked the door open. The light from the hallway flooded in, banishing the darkness for a moment. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating like smoke in the light. But just as I thought I was free, I heard her voice again. "You can't escape. You're ours now." It wasn't Claire this time. It wasn't any of them. It was something else. A low, guttural growl. A noise that wasn't human. And I knew, deep down, that I had only just begun to understand the true horror of what I had unleashed. I turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness of the hallway, the whispering growing louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Whatever was chasing me now, whatever had been watching me for all this time, was real. It wasn't just the memories or the shadows. It was something far worse. I had never heard of the town of Ketterfield before. It wasn't on any map I had seen, but when I found it, something felt off. I arrived on a cool, gray morning, with mist swirling around the edges of the town. There was no one in sight, just an eerie stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. At first, I thought it was just a sleepy little place. A town that no one had heard of, a place where everyone knew each other's name. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to sense that something wasn't right. It started small. The quiet moments. The strange shadows that would shift at the corner of my eye. The odd looks I got from the few people I passed on the street, their eyes lingering too long, too cold. They never spoke to me, just watched, as if they knew something I didn't. I found a place to stay, a small inn on the edge of town, next to an old cemetery. The innkeeper, a thin, elderly woman with skin like parchment, seemed to smile a little too wide when she handed me the key. Her hands were cold, like she had been holding something frozen for hours. The room she gave me was on the second floor, with a view of the graveyard. The moonlight outside cast long shadows over the headstones, their jagged edges cutting through the fog like teeth. That first night, I thought I heard a voice, just a whisper, calling my name. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, closer. They seemed to come from the walls, from beneath the floor, from the corners of the room. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that wrapped around me like a cold wind. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, I noticed something in the corner of the room, a shadow, deeper than the rest of the darkness, moving ever so slightly. It wasn't cast by anything I could see, and it didn't move like a normal shadow. It was alive, twisting and turning, as though it was trying to reach me. I turned away quickly, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't think straight. The whispers, the shadows, it was all too much. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But the door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I pushed, I pulled, I banged on the door with my fists, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in as the whispers grew louder. I could feel the weight of them on my skin, the cold, clammy fingers of the voices crawling into my mind, into my thoughts. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, like something from the deepest part of the earth. It echoed through the room, shaking the floor beneath me. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't just the voices anymore. Something was here, something alive. Something that had been waiting. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows were moving now, creeping toward me with purpose, each one more distinct than the last. They had form, figures, faces, eyes. Faces I didn't recognize, but that seemed somehow familiar. And then I saw her. A woman, her figure partially obscured by the darkness, standing in the corner of the room. She was dressed in black, her face hidden in shadow, but her eyes glowed like embers, burning through the darkness. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at her as she slowly stepped toward me. You shouldn't have come. Her voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves, but it filled the room, pressing against my chest, choking me. The sins of this place will never leave. They never forget. Her words pierced through me, but I couldn't process them. The shadows around her began to twist, their forms growing sharper, more defined, until they weren't shadows anymore, they were people. Silent figures, their faces contorted in pain, their hands outstretched toward me, reaching for me. The door, still locked, began to rattle, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. I could hear it, scratching, clawing, scraping, like nails on wood, desperate and frantic. The woman in the corner stepped closer, her glowing eyes fixed on mine. The sins of the past will always be remembered, she whispered. And those who are guilty will be punished. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing in on me. The air was thick with it, this presence, this force that had been waiting. I had to get out. I forced my hand to the window, clawing at the frame until I could pull it open. The cold night air flooded in, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed out, jumping down into the foggy yard below, landing hard on the damp grass. I ran, but the whispers followed me. The shadows chased me. I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew I couldn't stop. I heard the woman's voice again, distant, but still close. You're one of them now. You'll never escape. The sins of this place will follow you, just like they follow everyone else. As I fled into the fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not just running from the town, but from something much older, much darker, something that had been waiting for me to arrive. I didn't know if I was running to safety or deeper into the heart of the nightmare. All I knew was that Ketterfield was not a place you could leave. And whatever it was hungry. And it was only just beginning. I ran through the fog, my legs burning, heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like a small eternity as I stumbled over the uneven ground, my eyes scanning the mist for any sign of movement. The air was thick with a suffocating chill, as if the very atmosphere of Ketterfield was trying to drown me. I could hear my breath, harsh and ragged, but there was something else beneath it, the faintest whisper, a murmur that grew louder with every passing second. I tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. The whispers were everywhere, crawling under my skin, clawing at my sanity. They weren't just voices. They were memories, old and bitter, filled with regret and despair. I couldn't understand them, but I felt them pressing against my thoughts, infecting my mind. I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air, the fog wrapping around me like a shroud. My eyes darted frantically as I tried to find a way out, but the landscape seemed to shift. The trees, once familiar, now looked foreign and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Then I saw it. A building, half hidden by the mist. The shape of it was jagged, as though it had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and covered in ivy. But it wasn't just the building that caught my attention, it was the figure standing in the doorway. A man. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, his stance rigid and still. I froze. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if urging me to go toward him. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong to this world. Come inside, his voice was soft, low, and without emotion. You can't outrun it. Not here. I didn't want to move. The air around him felt heavy, and I instinctively took a step back. But the whispers, they were getting louder, more insistent, as if the very town itself was pushing me toward him. Why are you doing this? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. What is this place? What do you want from me? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes seemed to bore into mine, searching, weighing. Finally, he spoke again, his voice cold, like the grave. You don't understand yet, do you? He said. You think you're here by accident. That you've just stumbled into a cursed town, but no. Ketterfield is no ordinary place. It's a prison. And you've been marked. The words hit me like a physical blow. A prison? Marked? The more I listened, the more I felt the weight of his words settle into my chest, like a stone lodged deep inside my ribcage. I wanted to ask him more, to demand answers, but before I could speak, he turned, his movement unnaturally swift, and stepped inside the building. Without thinking, I followed. It felt as though there was no choice, like something was pulling me in, forcing me to move. Inside, the air was stifling, the smell of decay hanging thick. The room I entered was dimly lit by a single candle, its flame flickering weakly in the stagnant air. The walls were covered in faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved deeper into the room. Each face was more grotesque than the last, twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. But it wasn't just the faces that disturbed me, it was the feeling in the room, the oppressive sense that I was being watched by something far worse than just the portraits. The man was standing by a small wooden table, his hands clasped in front of him. The glow in his eyes had intensified, and for a moment I thought I saw something not human, lurking beneath the surface. "Sit," he ordered, and I found myself obeying without thought. I sank into a chair by the table, the wood creaking beneath me. The man remained standing, his gaze never leaving me. His silence felt suffocating. "You're not the first," he said finally, his voice low and almost sympathetic. "Not the first to come here. Not the first to awaken it." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "What is it? What are you talking about?" His lips curled into a bitter smile. "The sins of this place are ancient, bound to the land. Those who come, who bring with them the weight of guilt, the darkness rises. It feeds on regret, on pain, and it never forgets." I tried to speak, but my mouth felt dry, my words catching in my throat. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, hallucinating. But something in the way he spoke, so certain, so detached, made it hard to dismiss. "Do you see them?" he asked, his eyes glinting as if in amusement. "The shadows? The faces? They belong to the ones who came before you. They were punished for their transgressions. And you," he paused, his gaze narrowing, "you will be, too." I stood abruptly, panic rising in my chest. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. I just got here." He stood silently for a moment, then slowly, almost regretfully, shook his head. "The sins of the town are not personal, but they are shared. The land remembers every wrongdoing, every betrayal. And you are part of that now." Before I could respond, a deafening noise echoed through the building, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. I staggered back, hands pressed to my ears, trying to block out the sound. It was getting louder, growing in intensity, until the walls themselves seemed to be trembling. The man's face turned grim. "They're coming," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "You've triggered something. The past will demand its payment." I turned toward the door, my body moving on its own, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. I couldn't escape. The room, the building, the entire town, it was closing in on me. The air grew thicker, the walls seemed to pulse, and the faces in the portraits twisted into grotesque smiles. And I realized, with a sinking heart, that I wasn't going anywhere. Not without paying the price. The shadows, those dark, faceless figures, were already here. And they weren't leaving until they had their due. The door wouldn't open. My hand gripped the cold metal handle, twisting, pulling, but it was as if the door had fused to its frame. I pressed my shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. A rush of panic surged through me. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on my chest with an oppressive force. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They echoed from every corner of the room, every shadow stretching and swirling with the malicious voices of the past. The man remained still, his face impassive, watching me with those glowing eyes. "They're here," he said simply, as though this was inevitable, as though nothing could be done to change it. "What do you mean?" I gasped, my pulse hammering in my throat. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, betraying the fear clawing at my insides. "You cannot escape," the man said softly. "None of us can. Not now." He turned his gaze toward the shadows in the corners of the room, the darkness gathering like a storm. "Not while we're still bound to Ketterfield." I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to make sense of his words. What do you mean, bound? What is this place? Do you not see it? He raised a hand, gesturing to the walls, to the portraits that now seemed to leer at me, their eyes no longer just painted but alive, following my every movement. This is Ketterfield's curse. It was built on blood, on the sins of those who came before you, those who never left, those who betrayed the land. And those of us who live here, we carry their guilt, whether we want to or not. I stepped back, my chest tightening. I didn't know. You didn't know. But you will now, the man interrupted. His eyes were wide now, wild, as though he were struggling against some invisible force. The sins of this place awaken when someone like you arrives. Someone with a past, a history. He paused, his gaze fixing on me. It's too late to pretend you're innocent. We are all part of it now. Before I could react, the shadows around the room seemed to come alive. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shapes on the walls, and I could feel them moving closer, breathing down my neck, whispering in my ears. They weren't just shadows. They were something more. Something ancient, full of malice. I could almost hear them laughing, mocking me for being so naive. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable cold. My breath came out in invisible clouds, and the floor beneath me seemed to creak and groan as though the entire building was alive, shifting in response to the presence of the shadows. The man's face twisted in horror as he stepped back, his hands held out in front of him as though trying to ward off an invisible force. It's too late, he muttered under his breath. They've come for you now. I didn't understand what he meant, but something in the room shifted. The walls seemed to stretch, the ceiling lowering as if the room were shrinking. The shadows slithered closer, swirling like thick smoke, and I could see faces that weren't part of the portraits but real, twisted, and deformed. They contorted with pain and rage. Who are they? I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away from the faces that writhed in the dark. They are the ones who came before, the man said softly, his voice trembling. They're the ones who condemned us all. And they'll never let us go. Suddenly, the shadows lunged forward, their hands reaching out for me. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of things long dead and buried. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, panic flooding every part of me. The room was no longer a room. It was a prison, a tomb, and I was trapped inside it. I ran, but the shadows followed, their grasping hands closing in from every direction. I could feel their cold, clammy fingers brushing against my skin, pulling at my clothes, dragging me down. Their whispers filled my mind, louder and louder, until I couldn't hear my own thoughts. You are one of us now. You will never leave. I screamed, my voice breaking, and stumbled toward the door again, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't open. The man was gone, disappeared into the shadows, and I was alone. Alone with them. I slammed my body against the door, pounding with all my strength, but it didn't give. I was trapped, surrounded by the darkness, suffocating under its weight. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder. Not from the shadows, but from within the room. A voice I recognized. My own. You think you're innocent, the voice said, cold and mocking, but you're just like them. I froze, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice, it was my voice. But it wasn't me speaking. It was something else, something far darker, far older, that had been lying dormant inside me all along. I stumbled back, my legs trembling beneath me as the shadows closed in. They were laughing now, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of anguish and fury. And then I understood. I was never meant to escape. This place, this town, it was a reflection of my own sins, my own guilt. The darkness here was not just something that haunted the land, it was something that had taken root inside me, inside everyone who came to Ketterfield. It wasn't just the town that was cursed. It was the people who lived here. And now, I was one of them. Forever. I felt the cold hands of the shadows closing in on me, dragging me down, pulling me into the darkness. I screamed, but the room was swallowing my voice. The last thing I saw was the twisted faces of the damned, and I realized with horrifying clarity that they had been waiting for me. I was just another soul lost to the forgotten sins of Ketterfield. I awoke in a cold sweat, my body trembling as I gasped for air. My surroundings were unfamiliar, a dimly lit room with peeling wallpaper and a heavy, damp smell that clung to the air. The oppressive silence of the place felt suffocating, like the weight of forgotten lives pressing down from every corner. It took a moment for me to realize where I was. The last thing I remembered was the darkness closing in, the shadows, the voices, the chilling touch of their hands. But now, I was in a room that felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world at all. I sat up, my heart racing as I scanned the room. It was a small, cramped space, no larger than a closet. A single bed with rusted iron posts sat against one wall, and a dusty window overlooked the decaying town outside. I stood up shakily, my legs still unsteady, as if I had just been dragged from some deep, dark abyss. My hands were clammy, and the back of my neck prickled with a sense of foreboding. The air was thick, and the whispers, those terrible, accusing whispers, still lingered in my mind, as though they were echoing from the very walls themselves. What had happened to me? Had it all been a nightmare? But the stench, the chilling cold, the sense of despair, it was all too real. I couldn't deny it. Something had happened. And something was waiting for me. I took a step toward the door, hesitant, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The silence was unnerving, but it was different now. It was heavy, like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The hallway beyond stretched out, dimly lit by flickering gas lamps mounted along the walls. It was empty, unnervingly so. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was this still part of Ketterfield? Was I trapped within its cursed walls? Or had I somehow escaped? A creak echoed from the floorboards behind me, and I froze. The air seemed to still, as if the house itself had become aware of my every movement. Slowly, I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. It was a woman, her form shrouded in shadow. Her face was obscured by her long, unkempt hair, but I could see her posture, hunched and unnatural, like something that had been twisted by the very house it inhabited. Her clothes were ragged, as though she had been lost here for an eternity. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The closer she came, the heavier the air became, until I could barely breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my mind racing. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "Stay away." But the woman continued her relentless advance, her figure now emerging from the shadows. I could see her face now, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly through me, as if she saw something far beyond my own soul. Her lips parted in a slow, eerie smile that chilled me to the core. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "None of you should have." Her words sent a wave of ice through me. "What do you mean?" I choked out, fear taking over every fiber of my being. But before she could answer, a loud crash echoed through the house, shaking the walls. The woman stumbled, her head jerking to one side as though she had heard something far worse than my questions. Her body stiffened, her eyes wide with terror. She looked back at me for a split second, and in that brief moment, I saw something I couldn't understand, a flicker of recognition. Then, without warning, she turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she disappeared around the corner. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling. What was that? What had just happened? But there was no time to dwell on it. The crash had come from downstairs. I hurried to the stairs, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. I was drawn to the sound, like a moth to a flame. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the unknown, toward whatever fate awaited me. I tried to push the dread from my mind, but it was impossible. The house was alive with the memories of the past, with the ghosts of those who had been consumed by it. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the house was trying to pull me back, to hold me in place. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. I could hear faint voices now, murmuring from the corners of the house, like a cacophony of whispers, each one more desperate than the last. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. There, in the center of the living room, stood a figure. A man. His back was to me, and he was standing perfectly still, as though he were waiting for something or someone. His clothes were old, torn in places, and there was a strange smell in the air, something like burning wood and rot. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He slowly turned, and I froze. His face was covered in scars, his eyes dark, hollow. But there was something more. Something in his expression. Recognition. "You're here," he said, his voice low and hoarse. Finally. Before I could respond, the house groaned again, this time louder, as though it were alive and angry. The walls seemed to shudder, the floor beneath me vibrating. The shadows in the corners grew longer, twisting and writhing as though they had a life of their own. The man's face twisted in a grimace of pain. "They're coming," he muttered. "They're coming for all of us." And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't alone. Not here. Not in Ketterfield. The shadows, the voices, the chilling presence, they were all part of it. Part of something ancient, something dark that had been waiting for me to arrive. And now, there was no escape. The past had come for me. And there was nowhere left to run. The room was closing in on me, the shadows thickening around the edges like tendrils reaching out, pulling me toward an unknowable abyss. My breath hitched in my chest as the man's dark eyes bore into mine, a mix of pain, desperation, and something far worse. His lips moved again, but the words were swallowed by the growing noise, the eerie hum of the house, the creaking, groaning, as if it were alive and waking up. "They won't stop," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, but in the silence it felt deafening. "None of you will." His words felt like an electric shock, jolting me out of the trance I was slowly falling into. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I couldn't think straight. My body screamed at me to run, to escape, but every instinct I had told me the same thing. There was nowhere to go. "What's happening here?" I asked, my voice trembling as I took a cautious step forward, watching the man's every movement. His eyes flickered down to the floor as though he couldn't bear to meet my gaze any longer. "You don't understand," he muttered, his hand trembling as it reached up to rub his forehead. "We never do. But you need to leave. You shouldn't have come. No one is supposed to stay." I wanted to ask him more, to demand answers to the questions gnawing at my insides. But I was stopped before I could speak. A sharp, violent sound split the air, like the crack of wood splitting under immense pressure. I flinched, instinctively reaching for anything to steady myself, but the floor beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, as though the house was alive, moving and twisting around me. The man's eyes widened in fear. "It's them. It's finally happening." Before I could ask who he meant, the entire room seemed to tremble, the very foundations groaning as though something immense and monstrous was rising from deep beneath the ground. The air became thick, suffocating, swirling with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the presence before I saw it. A shadow, a shape larger than anything that should have been possible, loomed in the doorway behind the man. It was too large to be human, but the way it moved, slow, deliberate, like a predator hunting its prey, made every nerve in my body scream in terror. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. But I did anyway. The figure was made of shadows, a shifting mass of darkness with eyes that burned like coals. It wasn't fully formed, like a wraith, but it was real. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The air grew colder, the smell of decay and rot stronger, like something long dead was walking again. The man tried to step in front of me, his body trembling, but his hands were shaking too badly to offer any protection. "You don't understand," he whispered again, his voice trembling with fear. The sins never stop. They never forgive. It's what this place does to you. It makes you feel everything." And then, as though in response to his words, the figure moved forward. I could see it more clearly now. The face, it was like a distorted mask, human but warped, the features stretched and wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too small, the skin stretched so thin it seemed to pulse and writhe. It wasn't alive. It wasn't dead. It was something else. Something beyond my understanding. "Run," the man gasped, his voice cracking. "Get out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I darted toward the nearest doorway, my breath catching in my throat as the figure took another step forward. It was so close now, the air around me growing heavier with each passing second. I slammed the door behind me, but I knew it wouldn't help. Nothing would help. The house itself was against me now. I ran through the hallway, the floor beneath my feet seeming to collapse with each step. The walls, once familiar, now felt as though they were closing in, warping and twisting. I heard the creak of the door I had just closed behind me, followed by a heavy, grinding sound, as if the house itself was moving, adjusting, trying to trap me. The figure was still there, lurking just out of my line of sight, waiting, following. I had to keep going. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything that could save me from this place. But with every step, it became clearer, there was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone who dared set foot here. The man's warning echoed in my mind as I stumbled through the maze of darkened hallways. You shouldn't have come. None of you should have. I didn't know if he was warning me or if he was already lost. Finally, I found myself in a small room at the back of the house. A room with a single window, cracked and grimy, offering a faint glimpse of the decaying town beyond. I rushed to it, desperate, my heart pounding in my chest as I clawed at the glass. But it was no use. It wouldn't open. The sounds behind me grew louder, footsteps, whispers, the soft rustle of fabric, like something creeping closer. I spun around, my heart racing. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure again. The shape was now more defined, its features more grotesque, as if the very darkness itself was feeding on the fear in the air. It reached out to me, its hand a black, twisted mass that seemed to stretch impossibly far. I stepped back, but there was no more room. No way out. And then, just as its fingers were about to brush my skin, I felt it, an overwhelming force pulling me backward. The room was spinning, the walls cracking, the air suffocating. The ground beneath me disappeared, and I was falling into the dark. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the voice of the man, his words drifting toward me like a warning from beyond. Every sin has a price. And you've just paid it. And then, silence. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.